Okay, we're going. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today I have an especially special video for you guys. We're going to be talking about laws of logic, and you may be thinking that's broad. Well, you're right. So I've got two exciting guests here. Josh Rasmussen returning. Thank you for coming back. And then a friend of mine, Graham Moore, who I've been meaning to have on for a while, and I'm glad it's finally worked out. So if you're watching this, chances are you may know both of these guys. Josh is a professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University, and Graham is a doctoral student at University of British Columbia. So I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves, as well as any particular research interest or work they may want to plug. I'll put, of course, their websites and stuff in the description of this video if you're interested in their other stuff. And I've got two previous videos on the channel with Dr. Rasmussen already if you want to check those out. So yeah, we're going to be, this is kind of a really broad ranging topic, metaphysics of logic. We're going to be getting into maybe even some Phil language stuff and all different kinds of philosophy of logic. So it'll be complicated and broad ranging, but it'll be fun. And so yeah, to start with, I'm going to have them each just introduce themselves, say anything else about you guys that you want to, and then kind of frame how you think about this topic, where you want to go with the discussion, things you may want to cover, et cetera, et cetera. So Graham, we'll start with you since it's your first time. Thank you both for being here, by the way. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I think I've already been introduced. I guess I'll just jump straight into the topic. I will say though that I haven't planned a 5-minute introduction, so this will be somewhat off the top of my head and possibly scattered. So forgive me if that is the case. I guess the first thing I'd want to say is that when it comes to this topic, the laws of logic or the metaphysics of logic, a lot of people, I suspect, who would be interested in this are coming from the philosophy of religion angle. There's a lot of, well, for this sort of audience. And that's because there's a lot of argumentation floating about that that purports to show that the existence of the laws of logic, or the fact that there are logical truths, is somehow supposed to be problematic for a naturalistic worldview. It's like something that the naturalists can't account for, and that's supposed to be a problem. Arguments of this sort, they range from being more or less well-developed. It's not entirely uncommon to find arguments of the sort where where really logic is just used as a prelude to a bunch of gotcha questions, where the apologist will try to trick up their opponent into saying silly things about logic, and because logic's a fairly difficult topic and metaphysics is a fairly difficult topic, it's not terrifically difficult to trip up people getting into saying silly things, and that's often how this goes. But that's not at all what we're going to be doing here. Both Josh and I have decent backgrounds in metaphysics. His background is much better than mine. I'm still a PhD student, but we're not at all going to be engaging in that kind of debate. We're just going to be trying to do an exploration of what are the metaphysical issues involved with logic. There are some arguments out there that are decently well developed, that start with the existence of laws of logic, and then they start to show that there's that because logic is necessary, there must be some sort of necessary thing that grounds the laws of logic. That is a sort of argument that is pretty typically run. The first thing I think I'd want to say about this is that when we start thinking about logic, I think it's probably not right to start the question with what is the laws of logic, assuming with the presumption that there's some kind of entity out there that is identical to the law of logic, and then we have to ask what its nature is. Rather, I try to think of this a bit more like a logician, where the basic data points are that there's a number of truths that seem to be true in virtue of their logical form. Case in point, it's true that either it's raining outside or it's not raining outside. Or another example, it's true that all dogs are dogs. Or it's true that, or rather, if it were true that if it's raining outside, then there are clouds in the sky, and it's true that it's raining outside, then it must be true that there are clouds in the sky. It's a truth preserving inference. I start off with these as like the basic data that we should account for that any like thinking about logic must start with. And then we start to ask questions of like, okay, so given that these things are true, or that inference is truth preserving, what must exist, or what must reality be like in order to account for the truth of the first two things, and the truth preservation of that inference? What are the metaphysical ingredients, so to speak, that need to be baked into an explanation of these facts? And this is exactly what we're going to be going into. I think that the main questions are like this. First, there are things that are true. I said that it's true that that either it's raining outside or it's not raining outside. That is a truth. And then that raises the question, okay, so what are the things that are true? What are the things that bear this property of truth? That's metaphysical question number one. And then the second one is, well, since we're invoking this notion of truth, well, there's a huge philosophical issue about what truth consists in. What is truth anyway? That's metaphysical ingredient number two for any metaphysical account of logic. And then the third important one is what else must exist in order to bear to the fact that these things are true and that inference is truth preserving. And then that's metaphysical issue number three. Some candidates are that there must be facts in the world. Maybe facts must exist, or maybe maybe just the truth bearers themselves. Maybe there must be a few objects and properties in the world, or maybe has to be another thing, which we might call the law of logic, an entity out there, a denizen in the world, somehow floating up in the sky that makes it the case that either it's raining or it's not raining. That seems to be the assumption that people make when they run this argument from logic, but it is an assumption, and it's worth investigating. Anyway, so I think that's my intro.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
that was great. I think that's a good way to frame everything, and a great introduction. All right, Josh.
Yeah, that was really good, Graham. So I'm thinking, do I want to dive right in and interact with your pieces? Maybe what I'll do is I'll put more pieces on the table, so we'll make a big mess, and then Micah can help us organize it together. So I like how you framed this discussion in terms of worldview. And when you're thinking about logic, it's like it's sort of this familiar thing that we can sort of think about logic. We can think logically, but I've discovered that many of the things that are familiar are actually very significant when you start thinking about those things. Like, well, what is logic, and how can there be logic? So I'm going to just come to my notes here. And on my notes, I divided all of my thoughts. I was trying to figure out, okay, I got to figure out all my beliefs about logic before our time together. So I just wrote down a bunch of things and I organized them into two topics. One is just, what are logical principles? Just what are they? And included in that question is maybe whether they are, like maybe we can analyze our language or our talk about language without thinking that there are logical principles. But so what are they? And then what is their basis? So those are kind of the two questions that I'm thinking of. And under what are they, I divided that into what they aren't and then what they actually are. And I thought that it might be helpful to model maybe for some of the viewers, this sort of method where you start with some things that maybe are the clearest. And all I can do is say what's the clearest to me. So I wrote down, well, it looks to me that whatever logical principles are, let's just have an example. It's a logical principle that for any A is A, where A ranges over anything. So for any object, for anything, that thing is that thing. Now, what is that principle? I don't think that principle is identical with this hand. Why is that clear to me? Well, it seems like if this hand were destroyed, that principle would still be true. There would still be something that is true, and it would be that principle. So I don't think it's this hand. And also, by the way, I don't think it's this hand. Okay, so the difference in hand doesn't seem to be a relevant difference. Same with difference in shape, difference in color. I have in my notes, logical principles aren't made out of salad or any colorful shaped things. From here, I draw a more general principle or proposal, hypothesis, that logical principles aren't spatially extended objects at all. That's just not the kind of thing that they are. And I have an argument for this. I'm not going to go into this argument now, but it's in my book on the correspondence theory of truth. It's based on communication. The idea is that we can use spatially extended things like ink on a page to represent logical principles, but we can represent the same principle using different representations. And so by the principle of identity, those principles can't be identical to these different representations. That's not to give you the whole argument, but that's just to kind of point to that type of argument. And so I'm just going to keep getting these things out on the table. And then once we have had enough mess on the table, we can start to try to sort it. What are logical principles? I say that they're propositions. And by a proposition, I mean a primary bearer of a truth value. So it's the kind of thing that can be true or false. I say it's a primary bearer because you might think that a sentence is a representation of a truth. So you could say snow is white. You could write that down 4 times. And all 4 of those are expressing a proposition that is the primary bearer of truth and falsehood. Now, I should clarify, I do want to leave open whether the primary bearer of truth and falsehood reduces to sentences or reduces to thoughts or reduces to something abstract. So I know that some philosophers will identify proposition with abstract things, but I just kind of want to leave that open. What I mean by it is just a bearer of truth value. I think of principles of logic as necessarily true, if they're true. I have in my notes that there are rules of reason. I'm not sure exactly what I mean by that, except that they're rules about how to think accurately or not accurately, and we could explore maybe different ways of interpreting that. They are apprehended by a kind of intuitive sense. You don't have to apprehend these principles by reason, though I think you can. So for example, you could use a calculator to find out some truths. You could type in 4 + 4 and get 8. And maybe you didn't figure that out by reason. You just trusted the authority of the calculator. Okay, so you don't have to know it by reason, but in principle, I'm not thinking of it as a logical principle unless it could be known by reason. All right, so I have some more notes there, but let me just say a few things about why they are, and then we'll see where we want to go from here. Yeah, let me actually just go away from my notes so that I'm more engaging you as people, not engaging my text here, see your expressions. So under why they are, this is where I'm actually maybe the most curious in our conversation because my thinking has radically changed. And I'm sort of at the edge of not knowing what to think exactly. I have a theory that I will propose, but when I was in graduate school, I was convinced of a Platonism where logical principles are abstract objects that exist necessarily and ungrounded. So the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4, the proposition that for every A is A, those things just necessarily exist as abstract entities. And there are several things that began to put pressure on that belief of mine. One of them is this paradox from Bertrand Russell, a form of it, which we can go into if we want to. But there are these different reasons that cause me to think that there's a problem with thinking that all of them just necessarily exist. And so then I moved toward a kind of hybrid view where maybe some principles necessarily exist and some don't. And then more recently I've been thinking about a kind of just uniformity where no, actually no propositions exist necessarily. The primary bearers of truth values are contingently existing entities. But when it comes to logic, there does seem to be something, there is a kind of necessity to it. I mean, when you think about 1 = 1, there's a kind of necessity to that my house is on fire, it doesn't have. And so what's the difference there? You might think, well, maybe it's a matter of certainty, like you're certain that 1 = 1, but you're not certain that the house is on fire. Well, that can't be it, because there are things that I seem to be certain of, like I'm certain that I'm having thoughts, but that doesn't seem to be necessary the same way that 1 = 1 is. And there are also logical truths. There are deductions in logic that you are not certain of until you do the deductions. So it takes some work to be certain. So what accounts for the necessity? And the proposal, I'm going to just get this on the table, is that what accounts for the necessity is that they correspond with something that's necessary, some kind of logical fact or logical structure. And this would account for their necessity. We could put it this way: they're made true by or grounded in something necessary. I know those aren't synonymous, but I also kind of want to leave open because I'm not really sure exactly the relationship there between the necessary and the logical truths. So I think, like, in summary, my general thought is that there are logical truths. There are truths of logic. There are propositions that are true, and they have this necessity to them. They're not made out of salad. They're not colorful. They are abstract in their nature, and they're made true by some necessary structures of reality. So that's basically my theory. Okay, so now that we got the mess on the table, help us to organize it.
All right. Well, it's a beautiful mess either way. So thank you guys both for your introductions. That was great. And there's so many directions I want to go. Like the whole time you guys were talking, I was like, I'll do this next, then this. So there's so many different options. So at first I considered just, kind of letting Graham respond from there. But I think one thing maybe we should do first, and this is something I think you guys might have, given your notes, and I could be wrong about this, it seems like you might have broad agreement about it, but it seems like maybe one thing we should just start off with is the question I think that you both raised, which is just, what is truth, right? I think you're both sympathetic to a kind of correspondence theory of truth. Graham, I know in the past you've been sympathetic to kind of deflationism as well. So yeah, I mean, we were talking about what the property of truth is. This is sort of fundamental to what we're going to be talking about. So I don't know if you guys want to talk a little bit about that. We'll kick it back to Graham here for a second to talk about that. I mean, as far as things we've ruled out, it seems like we've ruled out the idea that laws of logic are concrete entities. At least it seems to be something Josh has ruled out. So Graham, if you disagree with that for whatever reason, that'd be interesting to go into. But and also, it doesn't seem like either of you are logical nihilists. So that gets, that takes away some of my questions I had. But I do want to maybe chat about some of Gillian Russell's arguments, but we can do that later. So for now, yeah, I don't know, Graham, do you want to start and maybe just talk briefly about like what is truth? Because that's, kind of going to be essential here as we go.
Sorry about that. I muted myself so I could make noise without disrupting the conversation. I think I'll just say, you asked me or say that I'm in agreement that the logical principles are not concrete objects. And my answer is, well, yeah, I do not assert that logical principles are concrete objects, but I'm also very squeamish about talking about logical principles as if they're an object. It seems to me that one instance of a logical truth is the truth that it is either raining or it is not raining. And the thing that is true is some kind of representation, a representation of the weather outside. And it says something to the effect of that the weather outside is either raining or not raining. And that representation exists. Maybe it's a sentence, maybe that sentence also expresses a proposition, but that, and it's true, and we can explain why it's true using just logic alone. That's what qualifies it as a logical truth. But besides that, I'm like squeamish about talking about there being, in addition to my representation, the weather outside, in addition to these two things, that there's also a third thing, number 3, which is the principle. So that's one of the things I would want to say to qualify about my agreement that their logical principles aren't salad, is because I'm also squeamish about talking about them, which is not to deny that there are logical, like that there are truths of logic. just to clarify, I'm not that's not a commitment to logical nihilism. Okay. So to go to the question about truth, yeah, you're right. I was like, in my early grad student years, I was more keen on defending deflationism, and then my work now, which is hopefully will come out at some point or another, is me shifting away from deflationism. And if you were to ask me, okay, what is truth? My answer is, truth is a property of representations that have truth conditions. So sentences, maybe propositions, maybe thoughts. And they're the property they have when they represent things as they are. And so the thought that snow is white, or the sentence snow is white, or the proposition snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. But why this is like a correspondence theory rather than a deflationist theory is because I think there's a story to tell as to why the sentence or proposition or thought represents things as snow being white. Yeah, so it actually does end up being a kind of correspondence theory, because I think that there's it's not trivial that the sentence snow is white means that snow is white. That's not a triviality. And since that's not trivial, nor is it trivial that it is true if and only if snow is white. There's my introduction to truth.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with that. Actually, in my book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, I distinguish different versions of the correspondence theory, and I give some lightweight versions, which sounds like maybe similar to what you're perhaps toying with. It's kind of maybe a gateway away from a pure deflationary theory, where basically there's something more we can say, but it doesn't necessarily have to commit you to sort of all the ontology that certain correspondence theories are committed to. And it's also interesting too, because when I wrote this book, Defending the Correspondence Theory, I didn't actually believe the correspondence theory. I just wanted to see, I was just curious to understand the objections to it. And I felt like the objections didn't hold up. So the whole book is just answering objections to the correspondence theory, and also giving a positive account of facts, propositions, and correspondence. So it's very much like a construction book, like here's how it could work. But I still didn't believe it. I just believed it was defensible. Like I didn't think it was true or false. Like I just wasn't sure. But it's so interesting because when I started teaching classes, like my intro classes on the correspondence theory or on the theories of truth, I would use examples to illustrate the theory. And I would like put stuff on the table, and I would have the students, hey, do you believe there's something on the table? Then I would violently throw it off the table. And then I would say, you know what? I didn't even touch your mind, but I just changed something in your mind. Your belief went from true to false. How did I do that? How did I have that power? I don't know. I mean, just doing those examples like actually got me to think, you know what? Actually, if the correspondence theory successfully predicts that changes in reality affect changes in the proposition, whatever the nature of the proposition, we can explain that in terms of a relation between the proposition and reality. And you know, you could say, well, maybe not all propositions are true by correspondence. For example, maybe logical truths are true in a different way, not by correspondence. But then I would want to see that motivated, because my general philosophy is to start with the sort of simplest hypothesis that accounts for the data. So after teaching those classes, I began to believe in the book that they thought that I already believed it, right? Because I was defending it. But now I think it's probably true. Yeah.
That's true philosopher fashion, just defending something for the sake of, going through the philosophy of it. So that's great. Okay, so thank you guys both. Those are both great introductions. Again, there's so many ways to go from here. One thing I was thinking that might work to go from, and of course, if you guys at any point want to cover anything, like respond to each other, just jump in. Don't listen to me. I was going to say one place it might be good to go from here is something that Graham, you wrote in your outline, which is talking about a little bit about just what are the things that are logical truths. So what are truth bearers in general? So I think, Josh, you said you're sympathetic to a view on which they're propositions. And Graham, you said here that you probably lean towards them being sentences. And I thought about giving your argument for that, but I would prefer you did it. You'll probably say it better. So yeah, let's talk a little about this a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'll just come out and say that I have a very off and on relationship with propositions. Um, uh, so Josh had already introduced the idea. The idea is that sentences that are meaningful, they express a sort of entity called propositions. The proposition is the thing that's primarily true or false. And the proposition also, so it's the meaning of sentences, it's what bears truth or falsity, and it's also the things that we believe and desire and intend. It's the objects of the attitudes is the third thing that propositions are alleged to be. And so actually, so with that thing that you just referenced from the prompt, there's two things I need to say in response to that. One of them is that I'm ambivalent about whether we need to commit to the robust reality of propositions in order to account for all of the data here. I do admit that we do need to distinguish for doing we do need to distinguish for doing semantics between what sentences mean and other attributes of them. Maybe I won't go into that. But there's also a few problems with the proposition, like the propositional ontology as well. There's this paradox we're going to talk about eventually. So there's the skeptical metaphysical worries about the existence of propositions but what I had said in the prompt was actually regardless of whether you think propositions exist or not, there's some reason to think that that nonetheless the proper bearer of logical truth are sentences. And the argument I gave there, it's quick and not at all surprising. It's that the sentence Hesperus is Hesperus, asserts identity. That seems to express, or that seems to be a logical truth because it's an identity flanked by the same name used twice. And the sentence Hesperus is Phosphorus does not seem to be a logical truth. But under the understanding of propositions that I would endorse if I would believe in such things, the contribution of a name to a proposition is just its referent, and hence those two sentences would express the same proposition, yet one would be a logical truth and the other wouldn't be a logical truth. So that suggests that the proposition itself is not the thing that is that bears the property of being the logical truth. It's rather the sentences that expresses them. So that's the quick argument for sentences being the bearers of logical truth.
If I could just clarify something. It seems like there's kind of two things going on here. One is, what is the bearer of truth?
Yeah.
And then what kind of things are logical truths, or what is the bearer of a logical truth? So is your thought that when it comes to logical truths, those are born by sentences but there could be a truth that's not born by a sentence, or is it that all truths are born by sentences?
So it could be that there are. It was the former. It was that it could be that propositions exist. They nonetheless do, and they would be the primary bearer of truth or falsity. But to admit that isn't to
I
say
see.
that sentences are
Yeah.
never true or false. They're true.
Right.
They can be true or false. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally
As
makes
well.
sense. It also makes sense of, I saw in your notes as well, you were kind of thinking of logic as sort of coming out of language, or that it's sort of logically true because of, or in virtue of, the way the language is put together, something like this. And this is how logicians often do speak this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I could say a word about that too. Um, uh, so logicians would they they study logic by using some artificial languages is the thing that they study, where what they do is like they set up languages that are highly well defined and controlled so that all of their logical properties are like um are can be susceptible to like mathematical analysis, but and then they take sentences in these formal languages to be um the things that we study for logical truth and logical entailment. And and then one way to understand or the one way to understand a logical truth under their conception is something like um it's the sentences that are true owing to the semantics of just a select few bit of logical vocabulary, namely or, and, if, then, not, all, some, and then there's more. And and the way that this gets cashed out is something like, well, the rest of the vocabulary, it doesn't matter what they mean. They could mean anything, and these logical truths will still be true. And that's why it's just those select few vocabulary that contribute to logical truth. I'm not um uh I'd also add though that saying that, I don't think it commits me to this view that like logical truth is all just conventions of language or anything like that. Because it might uh um uh it might it rather owes it's like the logical truth is owing to the meanings of these of these logical vocabulary like and or, but their meanings need not be um the things that they mean might not be like constructed by convention or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Actually, if I could chime in, I was thinking that maybe your view about the logical truths being kind of grounded in the meanings could end up um, translating into another pathway towards thinking of these as even propositional. Because here's why: it's because you can distinguish between sentence types and sentence tokens, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're thinking about the meanings, well, here you're talking about something that seems to transcend tokens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's already putting you into the realm of the abstract. Now, just to be clear, I did say that I'm defining proposition as a primary bearer of truth, and I'm leaving open whether, in fact, those things are sentences. But then there's this kind of expanded definition of proposition where um, so it's a little bit confusing here because we're using the term proposition in some different ways in this conversation. So
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine the audience could get really confused about this. So I just want to make sure this is clear that right now what we're talking about is whether the primary bearer of truth would be a sentence token or something more abstract, maybe built up out of meanings, even like the meanings of or and, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, I don't know if you guys would agree with this, but I was reading an essay on propositions by A.W. Moore, and he said that there's this kind of, some people like to think of propositions as bits of language, and that's sort of a problematic way to define it. So he says we should, the propositions are what's actually asserted or what could be asserted by the bits of language and not just the bits of language itself. So I guess there is this distinction between
But if I could
propositions.
just to add a little bit here, just to make it kind of explicit and vivid, like imagine you write in red ink for any X. No, let's just say you just write in red ink, Fido is Fido. And then you write that same thing in like blue ink, Fido is Fido. There's this feeling that the color, like you're saying the same thing, even though you've changed the color. And this is illustrating that there's a difference between the token sentence, Fido is Fido, and the type, that's the type of sentence, or maybe the meaning really, because it is the meaning that you might think is what is building up the proposition or the representation or whatever it is that has the truth value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good stuff. Do you have anything else to say on that, Graham? Or you guys?
Yeah, that's good. Could I actually, I said something like probably 2 minutes ago that would come off as quite obscure. I think I feel like I need to clarify. So I introduced this idea that's more or less the logician's way of thinking about logical truth, which is something like true in virtue of the contributions of or and so on. And then I said, oh, but saying that this is what logical truth is doesn't commit you to the idea that logical truths are conventional or just like made up by the people who evolved languages. And here's the one way to put that. It's entirely conventional that we use like the symbols O and R to represent disjunction, a sort of function that takes two propositions or sentences and then outputs true if and only if one of them is true. And it's entirely conventional that we use the symbol not, N-O-T, to represent negation, a function that like outputs a true proposition if and only if the input is false. But it's not at all conventional that if you put the or and the not and have P or not P, that whatever input you have is always going to output true. That's not conventional. That's just a mathematical fact that we can't change. So that's the sense in which I say that logic isn't conventional. It's like grounded in these mathematical facts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, I'm curious. I mean, Micah, I want you to be able to lead us here, but I'm actually curious, Graham, to explore what your ontology of facts might be. So what is a mathematical fact? What is it? It may not be a thing, depending on what you mean by thing.
Yeah.
Curious.
Yeah, so like the question now is, do I need to commit to the existence of mathematical entities like functions to have this understanding of logical truth? Is that the question, or is it
or it's maybe even prior to that? It's just kind of, what do you mean? Like when you're talking about math, you're saying that's a mathematical fact. What are you referring to? What do you mean? What are you talking about?
Well, just that that take any sentence that has the form P or not P, and understood with the or and the not having the function that they do, which is to, or has the disjunction function, not has the negation function. Take any sentence of that sort. I just mean that whatever truth values you feed in for the P, the thing in the proposition place, you're always going to output the truth value true. I'm not sure if saying that much needs to now commit me to giving like an ontology of facts. I was hoping
I hear you. I mean, it's sort of like saying, it's necessary that such and such. And then I say, well, what is the it? Right. I mean, this is actually one of the arguments for sort of the reality of the truth bearer, is that we talk about, like, we point to these things. We say that there is this thing that's necessary or this thing that's a fact. But yeah, it is a separate question. How do we analyze or talk about that? And I think what you're suggesting is that maybe we don't have to read an ontology off of our language. I think is perhaps what you're suggesting.
Yes, I don't think that me using the language of facts requires me to read an ontology of facts off of it. When I say it is a fact that P, what I mean is P. Um, can I? So you, when you asked me that question, we started off talking about like the reality of facts, but then you also said, um, uh, that you also had mentioned propositions as well. I thought you might have been treating them as interchangeable. Am I right about that?
Well, so I wasn't sure what you meant.
Okay.
So one way that this is how I carve it up in my book. I have got a chapter on facts and a chapter on propositions. And I just define a fact as whatever it is that propositions correspond to. And then the proposition, just whatever it is, is the primary bearer of a truth value. So that leaves open different theories of both facts and propositions. And so then I end up giving what I call an arrangement theory of facts. So a fact is just an arrangement of things. For example, if you have snow is white, then you've got an arrangement of snow and whiteness tied together by exemplification. Then the proposition that snow is white corresponds to that fact that snow is white. And interestingly, the proposition is also an arrangement. It's an arrangement on the theory that I give of abstract properties. So you have the property of being snow, the property of being whiteness, and then there's an arrangement of those properties tied together so that when this proposition, which is an arrangement of properties, is true, then it corresponds to the arrangement of snow and whiteness through exemplification of its constituents. And so that's how I explain the link between truth and fact.
It's interesting. So, so propositions are not identical to facts generally, because facts have concrete entities in them, and propositions don't. And then the representation between a proposition and a fact will be the same relation as property and things that bear it, or like instantiation.
It's analyzed in terms of that. Yeah. It's a correspondence relation that I analyze in terms of property exemplification. And one of the things that's kind of innovative of my account of facts is that I have abstract facts as well. These are arrangements of abstract entities. And so this is how you can have logical facts that aren't themselves propositional. They aren't bearers of truth value. They're a basis for logical truths. And actually, I was thinking you might kind of appreciate this sort of idea, because then you can have the representations be contingent things like sentences or mental things or meetings or whatever they are. They're contingent. And then there's a basis for them in reality. So they're like pointing to this reality. Yeah. So that's the theory.
Cool. Yeah, that is a neat theory. I'm wondering now if we should pursue this for one of the questions that was guiding this discussion, which was like what must exist for a logical for there to be a logical truth.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding you, you would say that for there to be a logical truth, there would be a logical fact.
Yeah.
There must exist a logical fact. So it's a logical truth that either it's raining or it's not raining. And the thing that is true is a proposition. And that's some sort of structure of properties. And then there's a fact, a fairly complex fact that must consist of like of rain, I guess. The location that is referred to, that is contextually supplied when we say it's raining. And then, but also there has to be these like logical items baked into the facts, right? Like the thing that the not and the or correspond to. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I kind of have some different options on that. I actually have a whole chapter on or, like what is or, there's these logical relations. Do you have these logical facts? Do they bake in those things? my latest thinking, and I was like thinking, okay, I got to figure all this out now, but I'm not really sure. But my latest thinking, kind of in the spirit of modesty, is to think that the logical fact can ground many different equivalent propositions. So it might not have, well, what was the, just so I'm clear, what was the logical proposition that you expressed?
It was either it's raining or it's not raining.
Okay, either it's raining or it's not. Yeah, like, so there might be this more general logical fact that for any P, either P or not P, and then that will be a ground for infinitely many propositions. But I'm not really sure. I mean, I really am just not sure what to say about the structure of these things. I do have this aboutness condition where the proposition corresponds to what it's about. So if I say snow is white, that's probably not going to correspond to my ear. Why? Why? Well, it's because it's not about my ear. So it seems like by example, there's an aboutness condition, and that's what that would incline me to think that all truths correspond to what they're about, including logical truths.
As you're wrestling with, like, what is this fact that this logical truth corresponds to?
Yeah.
I myself am very inclined to have a view that that basically just says this: for a sentence or proposition, like either snow is white or snow is not white, the things that must exist to, like, witness this truth, the things in the world that this is about, would have to be, well, snow. It mentions snow, so if it refers to snow, snow must exist. Maybe since the property of whiteness was expressed in there, maybe we also have to commit to an ontology that includes properties as well. But besides that, I'm not sure we need actually any further things for this to be true. And the story I would give would be like, okay, well, the meaning of the sentence or proposition "snow is white" is entirely accounted for by just positing snow and whiteness, and then we can say that the way that this proposition or sentence is put together is that it also includes these logical terms that act to that act to make contributions to the truth conditions that are basically given by, well, the standard, like, understood through by the truth functions that these things have. So that snow is white is not true is true if and only if snow is white. Snow is not white is true if and only if snow is white is false. And P or Q is true if and only if one of those disjuncts are true. Cook them together and turn them through the semantic machine, and out comes the truth conditions that snow is white is true if and only if, or snow is white or snow is not white is true if and only if snow is white or snow is not white. But it's just like, what has to exist is just snow and the property of whiteness, and then we have these semantic rules that, like, churn out these truth conditions.
So yeah, actually, I'm very open to this idea that we can put it into the machine, and then kind of like whatever's entailed by the necessary rules will be true, even if the truth maker doesn't just, like, exist without them. That, I like that metaphor of the machine. So let me think about this with you here. So think instead of talking about snow, let's talk about unicorns. So let's say we say unicorns exist or they don't, right? Now, if our analysis of snow is white or it isn't is going to be based in, like, snow actually existing, and then that's enough to ground snow is white or is not, then by that same reasoning, I would think that unicorns exist or they don't exist would be based in unicorns actually existing.
Mhm.
But that doesn't seem like that's going to work. It seems like there's something else that makes that true, because like what it's referring to doesn't actually exist. And then, well, what is it? And I mean, in my book, I talk about these abstract relations. But since writing the book, I'm actually more open to the idea that maybe it's something simpler. It's like maybe there's this more basic fact of the lack of unicorns. There's just a lacking of unicorns. And then we put that fact into the logic machine, and it entails that
Mhm.
either unicorns exist or they don't. And so we get all the things out that are entailed. And maybe that's a way of saying something that's close to what you said, but still more than what you said, to account for the logical
Yeah,
facts about fictional objects.
yeah. We don't even need to bring in the logical facts that mention unicorns here. Just the fact that, or the truth that there is no unicorns, or unicorns don't exist. Um, that like I very much favor the view of like a referentialist view of meaning, where the meanings of
Mills theory.
yeah. um so the meanings of names will just be the thing that is named.
Yeah.
And then of course anybody who buys into this view has a problem with negative existentials. So so in Klein's famous paper on what there is, he talks about the sentence, Pegasus doesn't exist.
Mhm.
Well, if it's meaningful, then it must be referring to Pegasus. And so if it's meaningful, it's false. And if it can't be true and meaningful. That's the paradox. And of course, this is there's a variety of ways for people who buy into Mill's theory to try to wiggle their way out of this paradox.
Mhm.
I think I'm like sympathetic to Quine's original one, which is just to say that that the contribution of Pegasus isn't really like that of a name. It's more of the sentence is more like saying there are no things that have that have that are winged horses and have the other attributes described by Greek mythology. So that's one way to like wiggle out of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, in the philosophy of language, of course, there are different theories about the reference of terms. And in my book, I actually talk about how to give the correspondence theory on the different accounts. So I talk about the Mill account, version of Frege. I ended up developing an account that kind of combines different ones. So I have a fine-grained theory of propositions, where propositions are built up out of essentially unique properties of things, or they can be. So like snow is white could be built up out of, well, if I have a proposition about you, particularly about Graham, then that's going to be built up out of an essentially unique property about you. But I can refer to you in different ways. And so because I can refer to you in different ways on Mill's account, then it's like that's just all the same proposition because it's built up from the same meanings. But on the fine grain account, the different ways actually encode different meanings because they're different properties. So anyway, there are different accounts that we could give to account for that. But going back to, well, Evan, Micah, help us out. Where are we at in the landscape here?
Yeah, I mean, if you can go anywhere you want. I enjoyed that discussion. I have some questions on like the metaphysical side, or like the way different metaphysical pictures may. Graham had a note about this, but how different metaphysical pictures may yield different systems of logic.
Yeah.
And I had questions about that related to something else too, but it's sort of taking us in a little bit of a different direction. So yeah, if you have anything else you wanted to go back on there with Graham on this, yeah, go ahead with that too. Or if you want to move on, we can move on.
Well, I was actually trying to remember that. I was trying to remember exactly kind of what was at stake, because the big picture in my mind is what are logical principles, and then where do they come from, or how can they be there? And I think that's related to like what sort of metaphysics has to be in place for there to be logical truths.
And I think it's also part of element of that question Graham raised is it's an interesting question that you guys maybe could talk about a little bit, is whether or not metaphysical pictures do yield different logics, or if the logic is just kind of independent of these metaphysical pictures, whether it's going to be like intentional or paraconsistent or classical logic. Like, does that have, maybe that's an interesting place we can go real fast is, does that have anything to do with the broader metaphysical picture, or is our logical system just going to be independent of that? So yeah, if that
Yes,
sounds good.
I don't know how helpful this will be. I mean, I just tend to be kind of a realist about these things. So I think that fundamentally there are these abstract propositions, and some of them are necessarily true. And among the necessarily true ones, some of those can be sort of detected by a reason or as an a priori sense. And I'm inclined just to call those the logical truths. Now, within the logical truths, you might be able to divide between the like strict logical necessities and like broad logical necessities. And the strict logical necessities, I see those as being the ones that are sort of recognized and encoded, and there's maybe some syntax that lets us sort of identify them. But I think of it as sort of an arbitrary distinction, to be honest. I don't think there's any sort of categorical difference there. So then when we're talking about different logics, like pair-consistent logic and different ones, I just think some of those are true, like some actually match the logical landscape and some just aren't true. Now you can have false principles and then deduce other principles from false principles. And so what you might be doing in a, let's say, false system is you're making true deductions from false starting points. So that's kind of how I would tend to think about that.
Okay, interesting. So to clarify your view, the kind of like underlying metaphysics will have something to do with which logic turns out to be true then, right?
Yes, because there is a logical landscape that sort of grounds the correct logical truths. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You have anything you want to say on this, Graham?
Not particularly. I as per my last claim, which is that I think that the ontology that's needed to account for logical truths is pretty much just objects and properties, and then the semantic workings of the logical terms. But with that, I'm not quite sure. I to be honest, I have really no idea how to think about the differences between intuitionistic logic and pair-consistent logic and so on in terms of like metaphysics. Like, what would the metaphysics have to be to underlie or underwrite the truth of one of these systems over another? I actually have no idea how to think about this. All I can do is like think about the reasons that people give in favor and against intuitionistic logic or pair-consistent logic, and just evaluate them on their own merits without thinking metaphysics.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it too. I'm trying to figure out where to go from here.
If I could actually, I think I'm realizing, I don't think we didn't quite come to the end of the conversation on sort of the metaphysical basis, because I think what I'm still curious to understand is when we're talking about logical truths that aren't about like concrete things, what would be their truth maker? Like if we say for any A is A, like that seems like that's true. And then I guess maybe I just would like to hear maybe a little more about how you would think that would be made true.
Yeah, so A is here, the A here is working as like a variable, not a referring term. Well, I would say that I basically just probably give the Tarskian story about how take the open sentence A equals A is here working as a variable, and now compute its truth for when A is taken to refer to each thing that there is. It always turns out true, and then for that reason, the truth conditions of for all A is A are satisfied.
So is that to say that each thing is
Yeah.
like working together to make that true?
Yeah.
And then if there was nothing, what if there was nothing? Then would it just not be true?
Yeah, so classical logic assumes that there's at least one thing. It's one of the riders they always have, is that the when we're coming up with models for classical logic, there always has to be at least one thing that exists. And so I'm not sure what to say about if there was nothing.
You're reminding me of Alex Proust once sent me an email where he was pointing this out. He was saying, yeah, from classical logic, it's necessarily true that there's at least one thing. And the best explanation of that is that there's something that's necessary, right? It has to be something. That I thought that was maybe too clever personally, but maybe that's true. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it just has to be that there's at least one thing. It's not that one thing exists in all the other possible worlds.
Sure, so it's necessary that there's at least one thing. Doesn't entail that. Yes, it's not a strict entailment. Right. But so I mean, think about like some principles that seems like they would be true even if there weren't one thing. Like, so I don't know, like being blue precludes being fully red.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so one idea is that that's actually about properties, blue and red, in a preclusion relation. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of abstract structure of these properties, the one precluding the other. And it would be true, like even if there were nothing, still being blue precludes being red. It's hard for me to see how that could be made true like by my finger or anything like that exists, really. That's concrete.
Yeah. Earlier I expressed ambivalence about whether this ontology that I'm using to think about these issues includes properties or not. So so like I'm fine to say in a world that had no concrete entities, there'd still be these properties, and those would be maybe those could be the truth makers or something. But
yeah, well, that's my view. I mean, I think that's a great view to have.
Okay.
Yeah, because then you have the abstract, I'm calling it the abstract landscape just for kind of a visual metaphor, but you have this sort of abstracta, and then it provides truth makers for logical truths.
Mm-hmm. I will say for a sentence or proposition that says for all x is identical to x, I thought you were going to say, well, consider an empty world, a world with nothing at all in it. What makes that true with respect to that world? And if it turns out that like I just can't say that there is a truth maker in that world because there's nothing in that world, and that makes nonsense for the truth value of that sentence or proposition with respect to that world, I kind of think that's not the worst bullet to ever bite.
I hear you. Like maybe it's not true in that world. Yeah, I get that. Actually, I was kind of intuitively feeling like it would be better to use an example like red precludes blue, just because of some of those obscurities.
Okay, yeah, I had some questions. I'm looking back on your document, Josh. Wanted to clarify for your view a couple things, and maybe this will lead to more discussion, perhaps, but perhaps it'll be something you can just answer quickly. We'll see. Do you mentioned you talk in your document here about like abstract truth makers and such, and you've mentioned this a couple times. So do you have kind of like a general skepticism about concrete objects grounding logical truths in general, or just like maybe contingent concrete facts, or am I missing that completely? Or do you,
well, it's not a general skepticism. It's just when I think of examples of certain logical truths, and I ask myself, well, what are those about? So I do have this kind of aboutness condition that propositions correspond to or made true by what they're about. That their aboutness is that worked out. I'm a little bit more hesitant on that now because I'm open to what Graham was talking about in terms of that logic machine. Like, so maybe you can get some basic or atomic logical truths, and then you send them into the logic machine, and they entail all the others. And so all the others can be made true, not by some more complex abstract thing that builds in all the logical relations, but rather they're made true by their being entailed by more basic truths that are made true by a kind of direct correspondence with elements of reality. And then it's just a matter of, could concrete things be the things that these more atomic logical truths are about? And it's just hard for me to see that by example.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's helpful. Because I share that intuition, I think. But that is partially what makes, the question of what grounds them interesting at a metaphysical level. To go back on that a little bit, I mean, we just passed the hour mark, so maybe if we can also go back a little bit to some of the stuff Graham was talking about originally, framing what's at stake and all that. I think you've been talking about that with the metaphysics. Josh, your view is still one that you tend towards. I guess this is one for both of you. You guys have been talking about this, so you've probably touched on this, but to make it more explicit, whether or not you think that laws of logic are necessary or contingent, because I know you mentioned in your document you're sympathetic to a view in which they're necessary, but they're all grounded.
Necessarily true.
Necessarily true, but not necessarily existent.
Not necessarily existent, despite the fact that I have a publication called From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. So I have an argument for that, but now I'm skeptical of that argument. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Do you want to walk us through maybe why your mind changed on that a little bit, or have you said most of what you need to do on that already?
It was pretty much Russell's paradox together with some other things, even just students balking at the idea that propositions are these necessary abstract things. And that wasn't enough to change my mind, but I have a lot of respect for people who have not yet been corrupted by philosophy. They have the natural intuition. Mm-hmm. And so, but it was Russell's paradox, the version of it, that made me think that they can't all just exist necessarily. So then I had a kind of hybrid view where maybe some of them exist necessarily. These are the basic ones. And then they entail more complex ones that would they only entail the complex ones if they're thought of. And then if they're thought of, then they come into existence. But then I started thinking, well, man, like it would be better, it would be simpler if it was just uniform and I could treat them all the same. And so I was really thinking, how could I do that? And it was around that time that I had this conversation with William Lane Craig on God and abstract objects. And I was just continuing to work out my view. And I experienced what I might call it an Aristotelian Gestalt shift, where I began to see how the abstracta could depend on concreta in such a way that I could develop this view where the propositions are contingent, even if their truth makers are necessarily existent. So I really am on the edge of my mind here. I mean, this is worldview development, in real time.
Real time, I know, it's great. Yeah, it's fantastic. Do you have any thoughts on any of that, Graham, or are you mostly in agreement, you think?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I'm mostly in agreement. I said quite a while ago that when it comes to propositions, that I have like a mixed relationship with them, but if I were to agree with the propositionalist metaphysics, then I think I would be sympathetic with the one that Josh expressed in the paper, the one that propositions are like grounded in thoughts. So Josh mentioned Russell's paradox. I guess for those who might not know what this is, might as well just say very quickly what that is. And that is basically, if you think that there must be a proposition that says something about everything that there is, then you must think there's a proposition that says things about certain classes of propositions, and then you can get paradoxes of self-reference. Not unlike the paradox that says this sentence is false, and the paradox that talks about the set of all things, or set of all sets that don't contain themselves. It's a tiny bit more complicated than that, but it's in the same thing. Anyway, so that's one reason to think that it must be that propositions propositions don't just like automatically exist for everything that there is. I think that's even how you put it, is that they don't automatically exist.
Yeah, they don't exist sort of necessarily. Yeah, I said automatically. That was kind of my term for that, because otherwise you get these reference propositions, and then that leads to the paradox.
Yeah. I mean, if you're also committed to the mill view of what names mean, that names mean their reference, which um I like that view. I one day would love to explain why, but it's quite complicated. But if you're committed to that view, then you also have to deal with another problem, which are actually, we already mentioned it, which is uh, propositions that deny the existence of something, like Socrates doesn't exist. Well, if the proposition has Socrates as one of its parts, one of its constituents, then the proposition, that one can't exist necessarily, because Socrates doesn't exist necessarily. And so we got another contingent proposition on our hands. That's another argument for the same conclusion, but it depends on this particular view of the meaning of names, which admittedly is controversial. So anyway, all in all, I agree with the where this is going, which is with the contingent existence of propositions.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's all good stuff, guys.
Maybe I can just affirm, before you transition, I just want to kind of echo and affirm what you're saying there in terms of the Mills theory of names being relevant specifically to this. When I was in graduate school, I took a course with Jeff Speaks, and he was a Millian, and we had long email correspondence like on this very topic. And it's so interesting because I remember one day just having the sense that he was right and I was wrong, but I couldn't see it. I just couldn't see how. And then since my mind has developed this new path, so now I can see how it can work out differently. So yeah, it was exactly on this argument from necessary truth to necessary existence. And then he had a way of blocking that argument. And so yeah, you're exactly right to point to that issue. It's definitely at the heart of this. So I just wanted to affirm that.
I think we're all, sounds like we're all sympathetic to that view of names, so that's cool. Good stuff to have down. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about Gillian Russell's logical nihilism argument, but I think for the sake of time, maybe we can just go back and kind of frame this back at sort of where we started and kind of go back to kind of bringing this all to head. We've covered a lot of really important stuff and like all the fundamental things and terms and ideas. So I wanted to give, because as Graham and I were talking about, and he mentioned in his introduction there, this relevance this may bear to, say, philosophy of religion, or I guess some people, it's an epistemic issue, but I think we decided to focus more on the philosophy of religion side of it, which is just that, like, whether or not the existence of logic itself, or maybe sometimes it's more about reasoning and kind of maybe something like a Plantinga style argument. I think we're dealing with here is a little bit different. It's more so on, be more so about just like the laws of logic. Okay, so to kind of, I guess, begin the process of conclusion here, we've covered a lot, so I want to say thank you guys both for being here. It's been really fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and got some clarity on each other's positions. And of course, we barely scratched the surface. There's way more to talk about with this, of course. So I think as a way of starting to conclude, we'll kind of go back to where we started with Graham's framing of this, maybe implications it has for philosophy of religion, or at least for our broader global theories of reality, both causal and acausal. So I'll have you guys, if you want to just each kind of give your closing remarks and the discussion in general. And we wanted to give Josh a chance to formulate kind of, I don't know, I'll have him put it however he wants to, but kind of what kinds of worldviews maybe laws of logic cause problems for, or at least what he doesn't want to frame it in terms of problems, maybe just more what worldviews cohere better with laws of logic or something like that. But rather than botch it further, I'll turn it over to you, Josh, and you guys can both take how much time you feel you want for your closing, and we can end with that.
Yeah, thank you. No, this is great. Graham, I appreciate the conversation. I feel like we were going through a lot of interesting territories, and the territories get complex. But I think coming back to this sort of big question about, okay, what maybe can sort of put it all together. And so I did add at the end of my notes, I want to just pull them up so I can just look at them. So I had a theory of an ultimate mind, since people watching this might be sort of interested in, okay, how does my worldview sort of relate to the laws of logic? And I say, okay, well, maybe there's this fundamental reality that has a supreme mind, and that the supreme mind is capable of organizing a world to unfold to produce beings who can apprehend logical truths. And then furthermore, that these logical truths correspond to logical structures that comprise the basic nature of this mind. And then the thought is that this isn't to say that there is some deep problem with other worldviews, but rather that this account can provide a kind of explanatory power that unifies some different aspects of reality. So, for example, if you have a kind of supreme ultimate mind, then it's going to have supreme resources, supreme powers, including cognitive powers, and an ability to intend a world to unfold to produce beings like us who can think about logic and wonder, okay, is 2 + 2 equal to 6, or is 2 + 2 equal to green, or is it equal to 4? You know, one of those seems to be true. And it sort of explains both how there can be logical principles in terms of the supreme nature having a logical structure and landscape, which provides the truth makers for these logical truths, as well as more specifically why there are beings who would apprehend this. Yeah. So again, it's not an argument really. It's just a theory that can show how different pieces can fit together.
Oh yeah, cool. I suppose to finish, I think what I'll do is I'll just like wrap up with maybe summarizing, I guess, like the different grades of metaphysical involvement we need for a theory of the logical truths. I think that'll be my way of wrapping things up. So so we started with this question about how do we make sense of these things, given, you know, within the kind of worldviews we accept, be it naturalism, theism, dualism, and the question I think starts with like, given that it's true that either it's raining outside or it's not raining outside, or that all dogs are dogs, or that all things are self-identical, like how much metaphysics do we need in order to explain these facts? And so the least amount of grade of metaphysical involvement we would need would be like a view which we didn't discuss, which would say, well, it's just the objects that are out there, and we don't even need like a correspondence theory of truth. Just truth is just deflationary. That would be like the most minimalist you could be about these things. And actually, that's a view that Quine has, the famous mid 20th century philosopher. And then the next grade up would be one that that would be the one that I'm like tried to espouse this time around, which would say that what we need are there to be objects and properties, and some explanation of how we come to represent these things, and some explanation of how logic makes its contributions to the truth conditions of the sentences we utter and the representations that we create. And then further up from that, we could also introduce a variety of abstract objects like propositions, understood as like complexes of properties, and then one step further, we could introduce also put into the furniture of reality a variety of facts that are supposed to make these logical truths true. And I'm not in the mindset to think that all of these extra steps are necessary for accounting for logic. And so for that reason, I think that I don't think that logic poses a huge problem for any particular worldview. That's where I'm at with this.
Okay, well, I like that as far as summary. Thank you guys. As far as my conclusion, I'll just say this was really fun. So thank you both for being here yet again. Had a great time with it. And yeah, everybody else, hope the audience enjoyed it as well. Stay tuned for more.